Hi everyone, Tim from Chamferzone here. Welcome to the Introduction to Blender tutorial. And to give you a bit of an overview of what to expect from this tutorial and also a bit of a background on me, I'm a senior 3D artist working in the video game industry since 13 years. And I've been working with 3D Max exclusively pretty much throughout most of the time. So it hasn't been until maybe half a year ago that I decided to pick up Blender, and I also had to learn everything from scratch. So essentially this tutorial is going to cover step by step everything that you need to know in order to learn the tools, the modifiers, some shortcuts, and also some plugins that we're going to look at. And at the end of it, you're hopefully going to have a very good understanding of what can be done with Blender from a modeling perspective view. In this particular tutorial, we're not going to look at unwrapping, but the next tutorial that's going to follow right after that one, we're going to then apply what we learned here and create a proper object with it. And in that one, we're also going to unwrap, and then later also we're going to texture it in Substance Painter probably. So stay tuned for the next tutorials. And this one here is really a step-by-step guide that will show you everything that's essential to know to get you off the ground and started. And essentially, that's it. I hope you're gonna like the tutorial and also Blender at the end of it. So I would say let's get started and happy modeling. Cheers. Hey guys, welcome to Blender. The first thing people usually do is press the middle mouse wheel button and just pan around a bit. That already gives you a bit of a feeling here for the viewport. So before we start, I'm gonna activate a plugin that allows you to see what I'm doing. If you click here on this little arrow that sticks out there, you can also access that by pressing the N key. You get this sidebar menu here. This is where we get to see our transform information, which by the way corresponds to the currently selected element, and also other things here such as tool, view, and most importantly our installed plugins will always appear here. And you don't have this plugin, you also won't need it. I just installed it so that here at the bottom you will now be able to see what mouse button I pressed and also which keyboard button. So that makes it easy for you to follow what I'm doing here. So while we're at it, let's talk about basic navigation here in Blender. I'm gonna bring up the Edit Preference window, because if we talk about navigation, we also need to have a look here at our key maps. And if you go over here, you can change it to industry compatible, which will then make Blender behave more like you're used to it from 3D Max or from Maya. And that might be something that you can try. For me personally, I decided to just go with the default Blender settings because I figured that if I need to look something up, there's a lot of tutorials out there where it's just the standard key maps that were originally intended that way from Blender. And that just makes it easier then to quickly look something up. As you can see, I already have my own shortcut file here, but for the sake of this tutorial, I'm just gonna have the Blender settings, and then I'm gonna change a few shortcuts where I think it makes sense. So this preference window, we're gonna get back to it very soon, so we can always have it in the background. Let's just take a look now at basic navigation. Pressing down the middle mouse wheel button while having an active selection such as this box here will enable us to circle around it. Mouse wheel lets you zoom in and out, and then pressing the shift key lets us pan around like this. And now let's say we have this object here unselected by clicking anywhere here in the viewport, and we are somewhere all the way out here. Now, if we select this box again here, you can press then the period key on the numpad to zoom right back to it. So let's take a look at our different view modes, which are perspective and ortho view, same as in any other 3D software. And you can see here, this icon already indicates that we are in the perspective view. And like it says there, if you press the numpad 5 key, you can toggle between perspective and ortho view. So there is one important thing that needs to be mentioned. First of all, on the numpad keys, we can quickly toggle through different kinds of views here. It will always tell you here on the upper left which view you're in. So for example, numpad 1 is the front view, 7 is the top view, 9 is bottom, 3 is right, and so on. So now if you use the mouse wheel button and get out of that, it will then go back to the perspective view, which is rather annoying. So in order to prevent that, we have to go back here to our preferences, and then under navigation, we want to disable auto perspective. So with that done, if we switch back here to our ortho view, we can now always remain in the ortho view unless we press the numpad 5 key again here to switch to perspective if you need it. There's also another way that we can toggle through these different modes that are on the numpad keys as well by pressing the Alt key. So it's kind of similar to ZBrush, where it will automatically then snap into the nearest view here, such as now we're in the back view, now we're at the top, and so on. So that is another very fast way that we can always snap here. And that means you don't always have to press the numpad keys, even though that's something that I like to do, because that way I always know I'm in the left view or the front view. And it's just a convenient thing where I don't always have to check where I'm currently at here in my 3D view. But regardless, it's a useful thing to be able to snap. So by default, we are in the object mode. The object mode is where we can create new solid geometry here. And let's, for example, add something by pressing Shift A, which will bring up this window here. And then let's add a cylinder here to our scene. Now you can see that it will always spawn that cylinder here at XYZ 0 axis, right at the center. And then let's say we want to take this out here, out of this box. We can then go over here to move and push it wherever we want to have it. Let's add something else. Let's have another cube here. There we go. And you will then see that it will add these things here into our currently selected collection. So this is basically our folder that we have active and where everything is in right now. Another thing that by default always comes with a new scene here are these lights, or I should say this one light and this camera here. By pressing Shift, we can select them together, and then pressing X will enable us to delete it. Usually we don't need that for modeling. So now you can see we only have geometry left here in this collection folder. But to be able to actually edit these cubes here, or let's say the cylinder, let's select this one, we have to switch over to our editing mode. So pressing Tab will get you there. And you see here we have all these extra buttons now, Inset, Extrude, Bevel, all these things that we actually need to properly edit this geometry here. So since we are in the new mode, we are back into perspective. I'm going to press numpad 5 to get back into the ortho view. We are by default in this layout mode here. If we go over here to modeling mode, we have more screen space because it gets rid of this animation bar. And as long as we're not animating anything, it's probably best to have the maximum screen space. And if we switch over here to our object mode, it will also maintain this modeling view here. So once again, because now we are in this new mode here, gotta tell Blender that we also want to have the ortho view here. I'm gonna press Shift here on these objects, press X and delete them. And then while we are in object mode, let's create a new cylinder. So whenever we create new solid geometry in Blender, you will see here at the bottom left, we can expand this here into a window where then we have further control over how we want this cylinder here, in that case, to look like. We can also change the radius and the depth. And if you're coming from 3D Max, then there is one thing to notice that is different in Blender. So let's say we take this here and we want to move this object. Then take a look what happens here to this property window. Now we let go and our property window is gone. And this is a bit of a, I would say, more destructive workflow than in 3D Max, where we are still able to edit our properties even if we move it around somewhere. And in Blender, this means we are now basically stuck with this cylinder. And if we wanted to go back and change the sides on that, like right now we have 64, we want it to be 32 again, we have to delete it. And then we have to create a new cylinder. It will always remember the last settings that we made. So that makes it a little bit easier, but it will always center it here at XYZ 0, right there in the center. So that would be the perfect time to take a look at some free plugins. And one of the plugins will, for example, enable you to also spawn geometry based on where your mouse cursor is, like we are used to do it in 3D Max, if you are familiar with that. So there's a lot of plugins out there. It's absolutely amazing. The community of Blender is great. And this is something that I certainly love about Blender. Some of the vanilla tools might be a bit limited, but then we have the ability to look online for plugins. So long story short, let's take a look at these plugins that I find essential and that I want to show you in this tutorial. You will find the links in the description. So the first plugin we want to download is called QBlocker. And if you're not familiar with Gumroad, the way that it works is that some people put free stuff up on there, me included by the way, and then it's up to you whether you want to be generous and donate something to the creator, or let's say you're really tight on your budget, you can also get it for free by putting in a 0 here. And then you hit that purchase button and you will get to the download screen where then you want to grab the latest version here, which is 0.15. Just make sure to download all these plugins into one folder. It doesn't matter where that folder is located because we're gonna install it then later from Blender. The next plugin is called CAD Transform, which has some really nice snapping ability, which is also more close to how 3D Max does it. And it just improves the general way that snapping works in Blender. We're gonna take a look at that later in the tutorial. So same thing here, make sure to grab it. The next plugin is called Text Tools. And if you're familiar with 3D Max, chances are you have heard or you probably have Text Tools installed there. And I was happy to see that it also exists for Blender. Now, we probably won't be doing a lot of unwrapping here in this introduction to Blender video, but once you follow my free Blender grenade tutorial, we will definitely be doing unwrapping there and also make use of text tools, as well as the next plugin which you want to download, which is called UV Squares. Just like text tools, UV Squares is a plugin that helps us unwrapping. Here on the creator's GitHub account, you can download it by clicking on code and then download that zip file. Alternatively, and if you feel generous, you want to go over here to the Blender market, and like I did, I purchased it here to support the creator who does a really amazing job creating these plugins. And this one here in particular was exactly what I was looking for. It's amazing. You're gonna see it once we get to the grenade tutorial where we do the unwrapping. So the last plugin for now is Interactive Tools by Maxivzs. He has a massive thread up here on poly count that is worth reading, because in there you will find explanations for every one of these tools. He made some GIF graphics to make it really nice and easy to understand what does what. And it's a collection out of different tools. If you're coming from 3D Max, you will find a lot of them familiar, which once again is a great thing, because out of the box, Blender has its limits, and that's where the creators of these plugins step in to create amazing things to enrich the Blender experience. So once again, a plugin that is a must-have, and like the other ones, or many of the other ones, it is optional for you to decide whether you want to support this creator, which I highly recommend, or you can grab it for free here by punching in a 0. So one thing I want to point out though is that here at the bottom of the poly count page, he posted the last version of Interactive Tools with a link to his GitHub account. I think when I checked, the version that was on Gumroad was actually not the latest, so make sure to grab it here from GitHub. Download zip. We are back to Blender. Let's go over to our preferences settings, and under add-ons we are then able to install these plugins we just downloaded. And as you can see, there's already a whole bunch of different plugins in here. Some of them are activated, others are not, but by default Blender already comes with a lot of plugins that are ready to be activated. So every once in a while the Blender Foundation looks at some really good plugins and decides to add them basically to the default setup file. If you download it, they already come with it. So there's a good chance that maybe some of these plugins we were just downloading eventually get added by Blender here to its core plugins that already come with it. But since that is not the case for the ones we just downloaded, we navigate over here to our download directory. And let's start here with the Maxivzs tool, Interactive Tools. Let's double click that, and then you will see it automatically switches here to it. All that's left to do is enable it. And then if you take a look here on that button, you see that it now appeared here. Not all plugins have its extra window, but this one here in particular does have it. And as you can see, it has a whole bunch of different tools, and you can always hide that view if it's too much. But in general, it always makes sense to have it opened for whatever plugin you're currently using. So back to preferences. Let's install also the other plugins. Next one is QBlocker. Let's also activate it. QBlocker actually doesn't have its extra window. We're gonna access it in a different way. We're gonna see it in a moment. But let's carry on here. This one is the CAD Transform. Another amazing plugin for snapping. And then we have text tools. Let's activate it. And also UV squares. So these last two, UV squares and text tools, we're going to cover in the grenade tutorial once we actually do unwrapping. So before we installed the plugins, we were looking at creating primitive geometry here in Blender, which by default always spawns in the center. So now that we have QBlocker installed, let's delete the one that we have here, that cylinder. So let me just collapse the sidebar so that you see better the shortcut actions that I'm doing. We access QBlocker by pressing Shift A, and that will give us the same menu that usually comes when we want to create some new solids. But now we have QBlocker up here as well. So let's go over and have a cylinder. You see on the left side, we already have an explanation that basically gives us the complete rundown on how to work with QBlocker. But in general, let's press down the left mouse button, and that will give us this basic shape here. And then if we let go of the left mouse button, we can then drag it out here. So this is how we can create an actual cylinder. And now if you look at the left side, it says that if we press H, it will convert it basically into a plane. So now if we drag the mouse up and down, you will see it stays that way. If we press H again, we're back to cylinder mode. So let's have this one here. Then let's drag another one here. As you can see right now, it's not uniform. So in order to have it as a uniform radius, we want to press Shift. And now it's a perfect cylinder here. Let's do that again. Press Shift. Another very useful thing with QBlocker is that we can spawn new solid geometry based on our normal orientation, indicated by wherever we have our mouse cursor. That is where we will spawn it. And let's say we want to have something here, or for example here. Makes it really nice and easy. But what if we want to have a cylinder with a certain amount of sides? So by default, it's 16. Now let's say we want to have a cylinder with 32 sides. What we do in that case is, while we have our selection active here, we press down the S key, and then you can just move the mouse to the left or the right side. So here we have 32 sides. Or we can also take that the other way, all the way down to 4, which basically makes it a cube. So this is how we can define how many sides we want to have. And then we confirm that by pressing down the left mouse button. So the other way of doing that, and actually the better way, is to create a cylinder, same thing, press down S, and then we use our mouse wheel for that. That way we don't have to worry to run out of monitor space. And same principle applies. We just define how many sides we want to have, and then we confirm with left mouse button. So whenever we are happy with what we created, we press the right mouse button, and that gets us out of the QBlocker mode. So let's take a look how to select things in Blender. Currently we have this cylinder here selected. If we press Shift, we can then add to that selection one by one here. And if you want to deselect something, you press Shift and you double click. Left double click. The only problem is that I found that, let's say I want to deselect that one, it doesn't recognize it because it basically looks at the object that's behind it. So let me try that. See, now it actually selected the other one. So in order to do that, it needs to be sort of out of the way. So now if I do it, it does it, if that makes sense. So same thing here. And now again, if I double click here while I press Shift, it won't let me do it. But if I press here, then it will actually do it. So this is a little bit strange, I must say. I would prefer if there's a different way where I can just press Alt to deselect, how I'm used to it in 3D Max. Maybe someone of you guys knows a way to do that, but it's still okay. This is just how it works, and it's not too big of a deal. So now everything is unselected. And then of course we have our selection box here, where we can then just select everything at once. So now if we want, we can move this selection around here with our move tool, which I think is pretty self-explanatory here, the gizmo, which lets us move things in X, Y, and Z. And if we select it here by this square, we can then move it here. In that case, it would be on Z and on Y. And here we would move it on Y and on X, and so on. And of course, Control Z, same as in most other software, will just undo the last step we did. So Control Z might be something that we want to increase actually, because by default I think it's set to 32. So I like to have that at 100. And another thing that I want to do while we're in the preferences is here under navigation, if we put on zoom to mouse position, it will then zoom in with the mouse wheel wherever we have the cursor. So I find that pretty nice. If we don't have that, then it will just take the center of our selection. I'm not actually sure if I want to have this on the whole time, but I'm gonna leave it on for now and see how I like it. So let's carry on with the tools that we have here. Rotating, it works the same way as moving things around. We will be able to make use of our gizmo here based on axis, or if we hold somewhere here in between the XYZ, we can do something like that, which you would rarely ever do really, because you want to be precise. And what you can also do is hold down Control to do these incremental steps of 5 degrees. You can always take a look here at the upper left. Let me just repeat that to see exactly the angle amount that you were rotating. And if you don't have Control, you just do it like that here, freehand. I usually have Control on. Another thing that works for moving and rotating and scaling is that whenever we press Shift, it will slow down the action. So that way we can be extra precise. Let's try that here while we have the Move tool. So this is normal speed. Now we press Shift, and that will just slow it down for us here. The same principles apply for our scaling. If we have the mouse within this white circle, we do a uniform scale. And then we can also do a scaling here based on X, Y, and Z by pressing on these buttons. And of course, we can also press Control and do this incremental scale stepping. And pretty much that is move, rotate, and scale. We have another tool here that combines all of these in one gizmo here. So you see we have the rotation here, we have the scaling. I personally find that a little bit cluttered, so I just stick to these three here. So in the meantime, since I started recording the tutorial, Blender 2.9 came out. You are probably already on that version if you follow the tutorial. But in my case, I'm gonna install it now and then switch over to this version and also quickly show you how to activate the plugins that we just installed for the previous Blender version. So as far as the plugins are concerned, we have to navigate over here to App Data, Roaming, Blender Foundation, and that's where you find subfolders for each installed version of Blender. So what we have to do is go into the previous folder for 2.8.3, and then all you want to do is copy over the scripts folder into the new one here. So let's just paste that in there. And that takes care of all the plugins that we previously installed. So I am back with Blender 2.9 and I will just reactivate these plugins and fast forward through this process. So let's continue to look at some of the plugins that we downloaded. The next one here is the CAD Transform. But in order to demonstrate that better, we also want to toggle our Wireframe Mode, because we're gonna snap in between edges and vertex points. And so far, we haven't actually activated the Wireframe Mode. You can do that by going over here and then enable wireframe. And now you see that this cube here actually shows us how many edges he has. And in order to make that a bit easier, we want to put that on a shortcut. So in Blender, you can always, wherever you have like one of these checkboxes, you can then right click on it and say assign shortcut. So now I'm going to press F4. But the problem is, if I press F4 now, I get the file context menu. So in order for this shortcut to be recognized, we have to go and get rid of this file context menu first. So let us go over here to our preferences under key map. And now we go over here to key binding and search for file context menu. Actually, we have to be here under name, file context. Let's see, there we go, file context. And you just want to uncheck that because you can see it's already assigned to F4. And unchecking that means that we made it clear, we deactivated here, and now we can go back over to our wireframe and change this shortcut here to F4. And now we actually have this toggle here on that key. So now let's take a look here at our CAD Transform plugin. By default, the snapping in Blender is pretty clunky, I would say, and I'm not even gonna go into it now, but this here is basically the best way to snap things together and pretty much provides the same usability that you're used to when you're coming from 3D Max. So in order to demonstrate that better, let's have a cylinder here next to that box. So now let's say we want to snap this box here to any of these vertex points here. First, we have to actually select the box, and then let's press N in order here to go into the configuration here for this CAD Transform. And it looks pretty overwhelming. It just means we have a whole bunch of different options with it, but all I ever need it for is the vertex snapping here. So I'm gonna press V, and now you have to also press G because we want to move this. So once you do that, you can see that wherever we have our mouse cursor, it indicates this here is the vertex point, where then we can snap it to something with. So let's hold down here, and then you can see now we're able to snap anywhere here to any vertex point on that cylinder. So then once we have it here in place, we just hit the left mouse button again, and that basically gets it done. So this is a very comfortable way of snapping, and that makes this plugin definitely worthwhile. So far we've been mostly in the object mode. The object mode is where we create new solid geometry for the most parts. And in the edit mode, once we press tab, we can then actually start working on these primitives that we added here to our scene. So let's go ahead here in our object mode. I'm gonna press A, select everything, and I just want to clear out that scene. And I'm actually gonna create a new cube here, not with QBlocker. I just wanna have it here in the center, like this. So now let's head over here to our edit mode and right click Subdivide 2 times so that we have a bit more geometry here to work with to demonstrate some of these tools here. So by default, when we are in the edit mode, we are in the vertex selection mode. You can toggle by pressing 2, 3, and 1. And 2 gives us edge selection and 3 gives us face selection. Same as in 3D Max. So let's take a look here at our vertex selection, which allows us to select any of these points here, or pressing Shift to select multiple ones. Then we can move them and scale them and just work with it. Let's go over here to our edge selection. And let's say we want to have this whole loop here selected. Then all you have to do is press Alt and it will make this selection for you here. If you press Shift and Alt, you can select the ones that are next to it. It will add it to the selection, and clicking anywhere outside of that cube will deselect the current selection. So pressing Ctrl and Alt will give us this ring selection, and pressing Shift together with it will then also add to that selection. So that way we can select rings and loops here. Also, one thing to note is that let's say we have an edge loop selection like that, and then you go back to Vertex mode, it will remember this selection and convert it here to Vertex selection. Another thing that you might wonder where it is if you're coming from 3D Max is the element mode. In 3D Max we have an element mode, which here we don't have like that. But you can have the same functionality by selecting any vertex point and then you press Ctrl and L. That will always select the current object in its entirety, and the same works if you do it with face or edge. So this is basically the element mode here in Blender. So even though this box is a bit boring, let's stick to it because it's perfect to demonstrate these different tools that we have. Let's say we want to delete this edge loop here and essentially get rid of the onboarding faces together with it. The way to do that is bringing up the delete dialog by pressing X, and then you want to go over here to dissolve edges. So this is basically the same as in 3D Max, where I think it is on Control and Backspace. And let's just undo that and see what happens if we go back here and then just say delete edges. What it does is that it only gets rid of the selection that we had, but it still keeps the edges that we didn't select together with the vertex points. So this is the difference. If we dissolve, it gets rid of everything, vertex points and the onboarding faces. And let's see how we can connect two vertex points with an edge. Let's press Shift to select both of them. And then if we press J, we make this connection here with an edge leading from this one to this one. And now let's undo that. Let's say we want to have a connection that goes all the way from here over to here. It will then cut an edge connection straight through it, which is pretty cool. So J is the button for that. So let's take a look how we would delete faces here on this cube. So first, let's go over here to our face mode. Let's select these 4 tiles here, and then we bring up that dialog again, and we need to then confirm that we actually want to delete the faces. If I undo that and I say dissolve faces, it will still remain that actual face here because it borders onto the other ones. And that's why in that case we have to tell it to actually really get rid of everything. So now let's do the same thing here at the bottom. And now let's say we go over here, select this edge and this one, and we want to connect that. In 3D Max it would be the bridge mode. And here it's the fill. We press F, and that way we fill that back up here. So the same thing works, of course, if we would just want to have this whole selection here. And that is how we do that in Blender. So if we delete geometry here, like this one, then we will see that our current object is showing as double-sided. And this can sometimes be a bit confusing because you don't really know what you're looking at. And in that case, I always prefer to enable Backface Culling, which you can do here under the viewport shading menu. And then once we have this enabled, we actually see that this is a hollow object and which way our actual geometry is facing. And that is where you can find that. So another frequently used action is to collapse something, and most of the time that would be a ring selection like this one here. So then we press M and we go over to collapse, and that way we have only one edge loop here instead of two. Same thing here. Let's collapse that. And then if we want to get rid of that one, once again we would dissolve the edges, and that way you can quickly get rid of edge loops that you don't want to have in place. So let's say we want to do the opposite thing where we have this ring selection and now we want to have an edge loop going through the center. That would be a matter of right click and subdivide, and then we can do the same thing here once again. So this is how you add edge connections here. So let's go over and take a look how to target weld vertex points. In Blender, we need to go over here to our snapping dialog and then change it to vertex. Then you also want to actually enable the snapping. And here under options, we want to enable auto merge. You can set a threshold here. And then we are able to snap these vertex points here and target weld them. So instead of having to go through these two steps, we can also make use of these Maxivzs tools plugin that we were downloading earlier. And in here we have a whole bunch of different actions. And one of them is target weld on or off. And you can see how it will basically just toggle on and off here our weld and snapping. So this is one of the cool things here with this plugin. And we can then also go ahead if we want and put it on a shortcut, or we can also have it on the quick favorites. So I'm gonna add it to the quick favorites, and right now this is under Q. So if I press the Q key, I get this quick favorite dialog, and it makes sense to add certain actions into these quick favorites that we use a lot. It's just a quick access. So my only problem now is that I don't really want to have quick favorites on the Q shortcut, because I want to put the selection box here on Q and also some of these here, so that it's basically mimicking what we have in 3D Max, where we have Q, W, E, and R for selection, moving, rotation, and scaling. Because that is just the perfect hand position. If you look at your keyboard and you have the left hand there, and it's just very intuitive. And I prefer that over, for example, having the move on G. So I want to put it on Alt Q. So let's go over here to our preferences, and then under key map, quick favorites, and Alt Q. So now we can overwrite our selection box here, and I want to assign the Q shortcut here to it. So now when we press Q, we can make our selection box here. So next I want to assign W and ER, but there's a problem where I want to have E for rotate, but right now E is already reserved here by Extrude region. So what we have to do is go over to our preferences, and then here let's see for extrude, this is the one, extrude and move on normals, and I actually want to have this put on D. Right now D is not really reserved for anything that I need, so I'm gonna have it here on extrude instead of E. So now I can put rotate on E, and I can have scale on R. So now we can comfortably cycle through here Q, W, E, and R, and that is pretty much what you're used to from 3D Max if you're coming from it. So the only thing that we still have to do is go back into our object mode, because in here we also have to reassign these shortcuts, because it looks at it as its own mode with its own shortcuts. So I'm gonna put this here also on Q, our selection box, and then let's put that on W here, our move. This here on E for rotate, and then we have R for our scaling. So let's create a new box here. I'm just going to use the standard cube that spawns in the center. Then I'm going to go over to our edit mode, and I want to subdivide that 2 times. So now let's switch over here to our face mode. And let's take a look at our extrude, which we have on the D shortcut now. So as you can see, we can extrude out new geometry here. And at the moment, we still have the snapping enabled because we were target welding. We can then toggle that on either by clicking on that symbol, or again, we can just toggle it here, the Maxivzs plugin that we downloaded. So this is how we extrude in Blender. The way that it works is that it's looking at our normal orientation. So that means that, let's say we have a case like that here, and we extrude these faces. It will also follow the normal orientation. But now let's undo that. And let's say we want it to go this way. What we would do in that case is extrude, and then we hit the right mouse button, which will still perform the extrude action, but it snaps it back to its place here. And then we can drag it out like this. So whenever you extrude and hit the right mouse button, it will snap back, and then you can drag it out. So that would also be a good idea to look at how to align something. So let's say we want to have this here perfectly flat now on the x-axis. The way that we do that in Blender is by pressing S, X, and 0. That will align it. And the same works, of course, for the other axis as well. So in that case here, that would be the z-axis. Let's just make that a bit more obvious. So let's say we want to have the whole thing here aligned on the z-axis. We would make our selection, press S, Z, and 0. So this is not the most straightforward way, but this is just how it works in Blender. So sometimes it's actually the easier way to draw a selection. So something like that here, instead of having to individually select these faces, we can then also switch over to our Vertex mode. And then with our Q shortcut, we can draw a selection. Actually, we don't even need to be in that mode here. We can also just be straight here in our Move tool and also be able to draw a selection. So this works in all our modes here, even if we are on scale. But the Q shortcut here for our selection box means that it's not associated with any command that will actually change our position. So that is usually then the safest way, just to make a selection and be sure not to move anything. So now we can again press S, Z, and 0 to align it. So one important thing to look at with the selection is that, let's say we want to draw something like that here, then we would actually expect everything to be selected. However, this is not the case. As you can see here, it didn't affect these vertex points, which were hidden here behind this geometry. So the way that we do that in Blender is to toggle to the Xray mode. We do that by pressing Alt and Z. And now if we draw a selection, we will affect everything that's back facing. So this is something that you have to get used to if you come from 3D Max, where we can decide whether we want to select everything with the back faces or not. Here in Blender, we have to always be in the Xray mode for it to get affected. So what we can also do is grow a selection. Let's say we have only these points here selected. Then we can press Ctrl and plus and grow this selection. Ctrl and minus will undo that. And then we can, for example, delete these guys here and bridge it back together. Let's switch over to our face mode. Let's select that face here, and now let's take a look at Inset. You press I, and then you can make an inset here into these faces, and if you press Control, you can determine the depth of it. And then if you let go of Control, it will lock it here into that position. If you press Control again, you can still make changes here, whether you want it to go up or down. So that is basically the inset here in a nutshell. And it makes sense to have the mouse cursor a bit further outside here to have more control over it. If I have the mouse cursor here, you can see that I have less room here to operate that. So I'm gonna undo that. And it makes more sense to be a bit more outside here to have this control. And also if we press Shift, like everything else in Blender, it will limit how fast we go. So it slows everything down a bit. So we can also access the inset here on that button, but in general shortcuts are faster. Let's take a look at the bevel, which is one of my favorite things here in Blender. Let's select these edges here, and then if we press Ctrl and B, we can decide how much of a bevel we want to have here. And if we use our mouse wheel, we can add segments to it. So this is pretty cool here in Blender and is a lot of fun. And in general, I would recommend you to just have some fun here with a box and just use these tools here, you know, drag them out, extrude them, go over here to the bevel and basically just try all these tools that we have. And that way you will be able to learn everything pretty fast. So as the next thing, let's take a look at our knife tool, which is over here, or we press K for knife. And this is essentially what in 3D Max we use as the cut tool. So you can see our cursor change to this knife. And if we draw it here anywhere over an edge, it will already indicate that it will snap to it. And the same goes here for the vertex points. So let's say we want to cut something like this here, some random shape, and then we come back here to another point. We still have to confirm it then by pressing Enter. So now that we did that, we have our vertex points drawn in here on that face. If we press the Tilde key, the one that's under Escape, we get this nice menu here rolled out. So let's go to the top view, or you can press 8 on the numpad. And now let's say we want to slice through that whole object from here to over here. In 3D Max, we would use the slice plane. And here in Blender, we go back to our knife tool and you click anywhere here. And then it already drags out our slice plane pretty much all the way. And then we want to confirm the point wherever we want it to slice through. And if you look at the bottom where we have this text, it says C to cut through. So let's press Z. And now let's confirm and hit Enter. And this is how we make a cut here through that whole object, the same as the slice plane in 3D Max. Might not be exactly the same, but this is the closest thing that we have to it in Blender. As the next thing, let's take a look at our edge constraint. And for that, I'm going to go over here to our edge mode. And I want to get rid of this corner here, basically, dissolve edges, so that we have this angle here. Now let's add an edge loop. And let's select it. And what if we want this to stay in place here? For that, we have to enable our edge slide. So now we're able to just have it in place without affecting any of these positions here. And we can also access that by pressing GG. So that would be the shortcut for it. So let's get rid of this box here. I'm back in the object mode and I'm gonna create a new cube. And I also want to subdivide it 2 times. So now let's take a look at how to make instances and copies. And this is important to notice that we are in the edit mode right now because this behaves differently in the object mode. We can make copies here in the edit mode, and we do that by pressing Shift and D. So that will basically take whatever we have selected, and in that case we had the whole cube here selected, and it will make a copy of it. And if we want to have this in place and not something like that here, the same technique applies as before. We say Shift D and then we hit the right mouse button. It snaps back into place, and even though it looks like this is one object, it still has the copy selected. So if we copy something here in the edit mode, it will become the same element of which we took the copy from. So in that case here, these 2 cubes are actually the same element. If we want to detach that, we press the P key and then we say separate by selection. So now you can see we have actually 2 different elements here for it. And once we hit over here to our object mode, you will see that the pivot is still based on the original object where we made the copy from. And that would be another use case here for our interactive tools. We can then go over to Quick Origin, and it will then automatically center the pivot of our selection here. In that case, the whole cube. But we are also able to go back here to our edit mode. And for example, while we are in edge mode, we select this edge and we press Quick Origin, and it will then take the center of our selection. The same works here for our vertex mode. Once again, Quick Origin will now put the pivot right here. And that makes this Quick Origin a very essential button or shortcut pretty much. And I'm gonna put it here on our quick favorite bar. So now if we have Alt Q, we can then just hit Quick Origin and there's our new pivot point. For now, I'm gonna actually delete this box here. And let's remain in our object mode and see how copy and instances work here. So in the object mode, we are not able to select any individual vertex or edge, but it's always, like the name suggests, the overall object here. And then if we press Shift and D, it works the same as in our edit mode. We make a copy here. And as you can see, it automatically makes a new object out of it. Once again, if we are doing that in the edit mode, it will attach it to the current element, where here it's already coming as separated. So here we have our copies. And now let's see what the difference is if we make an instance. So we make an instance copy by pressing Alt and D. And it looks the same. If we press right mouse button, it snaps back, then we can drag it out. Let's make another one. And here we have our instances and here we have our copies. And if you are not familiar with instances, let's take a look at what it actually means. So let's go back to our edit mode. And by default, we are in the vertex selection, and you can already see that these 3 cubes here indicate that they can be edited. And because we have instances, you can see that wherever you make a selection, it also makes a selection here on our referenced objects. So that means that if we want to make a change here to that, let's for example make an inset, or let's make an extrusion, that it will apply this change to our referenced objects as well, while these 2 objects here are separate objects which won't get affected because we made them as copies and not as instances. Shift D for copies, and Alt D for instances. So while we have this object here, let's go over to our edge mode and let's bevel this corner here. And now if we go over here to our object mode and we toggle the wireframe off, you can see that we don't have any smoothing group here on that. So in Blender, they don't call it smoothing group, and we also can't assign them individually. But the way that we can get some smoothing on here is by first of all selecting the object and then right click and say shade smooth. And by default, it will just basically apply one smoothing group on the whole object. And now it's up to us to go over here to our object data property. And under normal, we can then define an angle where it's supposed to start smoothing. So in 3D Max, the smoothing groups are very important for my workflow that I've shown in my previous tutorials. Here in Blender, we're gonna use bevel weights. We're gonna take a look at it in a moment. Another thing that we need to be in the object mode for is if we want to attach things together. So as you can see, we have 5 different objects here. And now let's say we want to attach these 3 here. What's important to pay attention to is in which order we select it, because the pivot point will always be taken from the last object. So let's select this one here with Shift and then this one, and let's press Ctrl and J. And now we have this as one object. And you can see the pivot point is the one from the last object that we selected. You can also see it because it's color coded. If we do the same thing over here, you will notice that this is now orange and the currently selected one is a bit of a brighter yellow. So now if we select that one, this here becomes the one with the bright yellow, and this indicates that this will be basically our pivoted object, and it will also then convert whatever settings this has on the rest of our object. So if we now Control and join that, it will then not have the auto smooth enabled, and let's see what happens. We then have to tell it to auto smooth again. So this is basically attaching in Blender. So let's assume we want to detach those elements here again into each individual object. Then we go back to edit mode, and while we have our current selection here, we can then press P and say separate by loose parts. So now if we go back to object mode, you can see that all these objects here are individual again, but the pivot point for each one of them is still assigned to the last object where we made the attachment to. So if we wanted to have the pivot point back in the center of, let's say, this one, we can then make use of our interactive tools again and going on the quick origin. So even though we talked about detaching stuff before, I want to make another example here out of having one object. And what if we want to detach, let's say, that piece here and make it a separate object? Then we would go over here to our face mode and we would grow that selection and press P and say separate by selection. So now you can see that we have a new cube here as a new object, and basically that is how we would split that up if it's already one element before. So another thing that we could take a look at while we have all these different objects is the isolation mode, which you can find on the slash key. It will then also do a bit of a zoom and basically hide everything else. So this is the isolation mode in Blender. So while we have several objects here in the scene, let's take a look at the material editor. The way that this works in Blender is that each one of these objects here has its own material properties. And essentially that is our material editor here. So let's say we want to have a color here on that one. We then go over here and say add material slot, and then we say new material. So now this material slot has its first material, which by default is gray and doesn't even show. But now we actually confirmed that we have a material here. And let's call it red. So now we go over here, assign a color, and then we have to go over to our edit mode, press A to select our current object, and then we say assign. So now the reason why nothing shows is because we still have to go over here on viewport shading. If we go here on that arrow, we can also put scene lights on, and we are even able to change the direction of the sun. If you take a look here at the shadow. So now let's say we want to have only a segment here with a different color. First of all, we have to be in the face mode, and let's just click outside to deselect. If we press Alt and then make a left mouse click, we can automatically select the whole loop here. If we press Alt and click in the center, it makes it vertically. So let's do it here at the side so that we have this horizontal selection, and then let's create a new slot, new material, and let's just call it green and assign it, and there it is. So one thing that left me wondering when I learned Blender is, if I now go here onto a different object and I go on the material editor, I don't see these materials that we just set up for this one. So in order to reuse materials that we already created, we want to remain here first in that one and make sure that we created the materials that we want to use. So I'm just going to go ahead here and make a blue one. Let's also give that a proper name. And then let's create a yellow one as well, just to demonstrate that better. So now let's say we want to assign these colors, these materials here to any of these objects. We then make our selection. With Shift, we can again select multiple ones. And I'm gonna select these 4 here. I'm not gonna select that one. Remember, that is its own object that we detached earlier. And then most importantly, with Shift, we select that one here as the last one, which then automatically becomes our active selection with this material here. And we can then press Ctrl and L and say make links to materials. So now what is important to remember is that this is our current active selection, which consists out of these 5 cubes here. Well, these really can't be called cubes anymore, but whatever. That means that with that selection, if we go back to the edit mode and we are here in the face mode or really any mode, we are able to select all of them here. Now let's press L, and then we can make an easy selection here and assign it with whatever color we want. So this one here, let's make it blue. And then remember, this cube here doesn't actually have this material yet. So all of these have it, but this one we left out. And if we wanted to assign it, we would then just again select this, or we could also use any of these here because they also have it. Press Ctrl L and say materials. So this is how that works here in Blender with the material editor. Okay, let's take a look at some of the modifiers in Blender, and let's start with the Boolean modifier. For that, I'm gonna create a new cube here. I'm gonna duplicate it, snap it back into place, and then let's scale it a bit. Something like that here. We can always change that later. And now what I'm gonna do is head over here to the modifier properties with our currently selected object, where we then apply it to. And in here we have all the modifiers that are currently available here in Blender. And here we have the Boolean. I hope I pronounced that right. And now let's say we want to have a difference here with that cube. We simply go on that thing and select it. And now you can see that it already did the cut, but we can't really see what's going on unless we hide this cube here. So we could hide it, or what we could also do is select this operator here, this cube, and then we go over to our object properties, go to viewport display, and we put it to not textured but wire. So now essentially we have a live Boolean view here, which adapts to whatever we do with that shape here. And we can then also go back here to our edit mode, and because that here is essentially just another element here, we can then further edit that, and that applies the changes here to the original cube that we pick from. So then whenever we are happy with that shape, what we can do is go back here to that object where we have the modifier on. And then here we can go on that little arrow and say apply. So now that operation is actually done, but we still have this cube here in the scene, which we can then just get rid of. So now let's take a look at the Bevel modifier, which enables us to make a high poly out of this geometry. We want to go back here to our modifier tab, and then we add the Bevel modifier. And as you can see right now, it just basically chamfers everything. If you're familiar with 3D Max, this is the equivalent to the chamfer modifier. And in here we have different limit method types. Let's say we want to put that here to angle, then it looks at this curve here and it takes that as one continuous angle here, so it puts the chamfer then accordingly. This works for something very simple like that, but in general the more control is given when we use the bevel weights. So let's take a look at the weight method. We put the modifier here to weight, and right now the result is that we see nothing because we have to go over here to our edit mode, and then while we are in the edge mode we can say select sharp edges, which is also looking at the angle here to do that, but we can also manually select edges. So now with that selection, let's bring up our item here. And in here you see we have the mean bevel weight, which we want to put up to 1. And now we basically tell it we want these particular edges to reflect then our chamfering. Within our bevel modifier we have these expandable options, and in here we can also change the amount and the segments. So all these settings here play a role in what it looks like once we add our subdivision surface on top, which in 3D Max is the Turbosmooth. And you have these two options here. This one here is only when you want to render something. This one here actually puts the subdivisions on it. And the reason why we don't really see it here is because we have optimal display on. Once we uncheck that, you will then see that our mesh actually subdivides. And since we have one massive n-gon here on top, we get this overlap. So we're gonna switch over here to our vertex mode, select that vertex point and that one, and then we make a connection here by pressing J for join, and also down here. So now we can see that we still have some overlapping going on, and this is where some of these other options here come into play. So usually what then makes the difference is to change this here from sharp to arc. As you can see, now we don't have any more overlapping. You can also try some of the others here. But for example, the patch gives us this pinch here, which we don't really want. So let's have it set to an arc. And we can also toggle on and off here our subdivision modifier to actually see what that looks like. So if we compare the patch to the arc, then you can see that this here actually comes with a bit of a curve where the other is perfectly straight. We also have another setting here where we have the loop slide. So really it's a matter of trying these things out and see what works best. So it appears as if disabling the loop slide is actually producing a better result than having it enabled. It seems to bring it further here to these edges, makes it more accurate. And the other thing is that if we press tab, we can go over to our object mode and we actually see everything without the modifiers. So essentially our end result is seen in the object mode, and then in the edit mode we have our modifier stack and we can work on it. So when working on a high poly object, we could also add a material to it to make it a bit more obvious how our high poly actually looks like. And I'm gonna add a bit of a roughness here to it, a bit of a glossy look, and that way we can better see, do we have any pinching and how does it look overall, especially if we go here into our object mode. So the most important thing is that while we have our modifiers on it, in the edit mode, we can further go ahead and change this geometry. For example, these two edges here. I'm gonna give it a bit of a bevel here. And now there's one thing that is a bit of a problem, which is that we have our currently selected and beveled edges shown as blue. This is how you know these edges have some weight information on it. However, these edges here we currently can't see because they are hidden by the high poly geometry. Only once we go here into the Xray mode with Alt-Z, we see these edges. So in that case, it makes sense to have a toggle for this mode here, which is basically another wireframe mode that really shows everything. So I want to have this here on a toggle, and in order to do that we can, for example, use the interactive tools here, which has this on that button here. So that allows us to toggle back and forth in between, and I like to put that on F3. However, on F3 we currently have this search menu here, which lets us search for everything in Blender pretty much, which is kind of useful. But I'm gonna put that on F5 instead of F3, and then put that toggle on F3, which kind of mimics 3D Max, and that's really the reason why I want to do that, because that's what I'm used to. So let's go over here to our preferences, and then here under key map, let's look for F3. And under key binding, we see that we have it here on the search menu. So I'm gonna right click in here, and actually, no, I'm gonna click in here, and now I'm gonna put that on F5. So now if we go here, we have it on F5. Before that, we didn't have anything on F5. So now we can go ahead and say right click, assign shortcut, and F3. So now we have a toggle for it, and here on F4 we have this toggle. So when we were doing this chamfering here on that corner, you see how the edge weight automatically gets put wherever we did that action, but it also puts it here into places where we might not want to have it, because if we look at it here, in the object mode, it has a bit of a pinching here, and it's not really necessary to have it because it's one continuous flow. So I'm gonna select these 4 edges, And then here we can go back, basically put the weighting to 0. And now you see we have this continuous flow here, which looks much better. So just when I recorded that Boolean part of the tutorial, Blender 2.91 came out, and it now has a button where you can put it to exact, and essentially it does an even better job when it comes to handling complex geometry. So I just installed that, and there's also another thing that I want to show you that I just discovered. It's called JMesh Tools. So it's a really cool plugin that helps us with the Boolean operations and some other hard surface related tools. And we're gonna take a look at it in just a moment. You can download it here. Once again, if you go on download zip, and then you just activate it through Blender. And if you look down here, there's a link to the documentation that's also worth checking out, where everything is perfectly explained and listed. So I already have it installed, and then it will pop up here as JMesh Tools. So before we look at the JMesh plugin, let's take a look at the mirror modifier, which is another very important one. So let's apply it. And the reason why we don't see anything is that we have a few additional buttons here that might help in that case. So enabling bisect now actually gives us the result that we expect. So it's often a matter of trying out here in combination with these buttons to get the expected result. So right now, being in the object mode means that we see our final result. If we go over to the edit mode, we see our currently selected object with the modifiers applied to it. So we can toggle that on and off, but we can also leave it on and then make changes here to our geometry while these modifiers work in the background. So something that is important to consider is that the hierarchy of these modifiers plays an important role. And right now we have the mirror modifier above the subdivision modifier. The hierarchy is basically inverted here in Blender. Whatever we have at the bottom is actually at the top, or at least when you come from 3D Max. So this here is the latest modifier, and the reason why it does this thing here is that we have it currently above the subdivision. Now if we drag that under the subdivision, you see that we have a much better result here. So essentially the subdivision modifier should always come last. And in general, I don't like to have this on while I still work on something. So it's something that I like to put on at the very end when I'm pretty much done with my highpoly. But while I work on it, I want to see what my edge flow looks like, and that makes it much easier to work on. Sorry guys, right now you're looking at a freeze frame. What I did was I put the edges back where my pivot point is, and then I go over to the mirror modifier, I go to the arrow and I apply it. So our mirror modifier will always look at our quick origin point, which in this case here is in the center of the original box that we were spawning before we made any modifications to it. So if we want to change it, let's say we want to have it mirror around here, then we can make use of our quick origin again. Let's select these faces, and then under our favorites, we have the quick origin, and now we have this point right here, and we are then able to make another mirror. I'm gonna put it here to Z. And this is essentially how you can do that. Now, you may probably not want to have this edge here. So then again, it's a matter of putting that modifier here under the bevel. So if we have it above it, we have this edge. And if we put it under it, it actually has one continuous flow here. So once again, the hierarchy is important. And what is also important is to check the settings that we have here. Because right now we don't have this here set to bisect. And let's take a look at what that means. In our edit mode, we still have the selection for these bottom faces here. And essentially, if we drag that here into each other, then these faces will remain. So if we go over to object mode, you can see we have some pretty funky geometry here. And now if we come over here and put that to bisect, it pretty much welds that for us. So this can sometimes be a little bit confusing, or it might be something that you forget to put on. So just make sure to really check your mirror settings, and in most cases you probably want to have bisect on so that it welds. So now I can go ahead and I'm gonna apply this mirror modifier once again. And what I want to do is select these faces here, also on that side, and then let's get rid of them. So because we are in the material preview mode, it doesn't show the backface cull. If we go in the viewport shading, it becomes clear that we only have faces here to the outside, and this is not double-sided geometry. So this is important because now that we put on the Solidify, we actually get our thickness here. It's essentially the shell modifier in 3D Max, and what it enables us to do is to add a thickness here to it. So as you can see, it does some weird stuff here, and that's again because we have to consider the hierarchy. If we put the Solidify modifier and drag it here to the beginning, we get a much better result. However, it still looks a little bit strange. Like you can see that this curve here is not really the same as this here. So in order to make that the best it can be, we go in here and then we tell it to go into the complex mode. And now you see we have a really nice result, the best it can be. And that is basically that modifier here, and it works of course also hand in hand here with our subdivision. And this is how we can create something like that here and give it thickness. So now let's take a look at our JMesh plugin. I'm gonna go ahead here, delete this, and let's once again spawn a cube. And then I'm gonna make a copy of it, and let's just leave it like that here. So now with our JMesh plugin, we can pick this box here, and then we put it to difference. And now you see it automatically did that operation for us. However, I'm gonna undo that, and then I'm gonna uncheck apply immediately and hit difference again. So now we are able to basically change our Boolean here in real time. And we didn't have to go through all these steps that we did previously. So essentially it already puts it to wire, and it just helps us being faster with the Boolean. And then we can also again go ahead and let's say we want to bevel this here, make a nice shape out of it, and then we say apply selected Booleans, and that leaves us here with this geometry. And another very cool thing about it is that we can then hit that bevel button, which brings up this dialog, and it automatically adds these modifiers here to our stack, consisting out of bevel and weighted normal, which further helps to make this more nice looking here for us. So we can adjust the width here. Let me go over here to the wireframe. Adjust the width, and now if you apply this, it will automatically collapse these modifiers. So don't get confused about that. In most cases, we want to be non-destructive. So I'm gonna just close it. And essentially, this is how you can be really fast. And this plugin, as you can see, helps a lot with it. We can also go ahead and click on that button to get rid of these modifiers. It still leaves the weighted normal on. I'm not sure why, but it's not like this causes any issues for us. And then if we want, we can just go back and apply it again. So now I'm gonna snap here into that orthographic side view, and let's take a look at the primitive mode. Once we enable that, it will tell us that we have several kind of options here. And for starters, we can choose between different primitive types. So I'm gonna go over here and start with a circle. And now wherever we have the mouse cursor and press Ctrl and left click, it will spawn it. So in my case, I'm gonna have it here. And with the mouse wheel, we are able to control how many segments we want. So I'm gonna have 18. And then I confirm that with the left mouse button. And now we're able to look around and this stays there. But now we still don't have a shape. So I'm gonna press E and drag out this shape here. Goes in both ways. And let's say we want to have it something like that here. Then all we have to do is confirm it by pressing Ctrl and left. So now we did that. You can see we have this geometry now here. It's solid, but we still have this object here. So that might be a little confusing at the beginning, but all you have to do now is press Escape. And now we're left here with this primitive. So then once again, we can just say difference. And there we go. We now have a Boolean operation here on this object. So in that case here, I actually want to go back to that object and say unbevel. Because now that we have this new primitive here, we want to have to bevel it again in order for it to take effect here to this new operator. So let's have something like that. And then once again, we are able to move that around and do a live Boolean operation here. So this is pretty amazing stuff. And then of course we can take a look and see if it maybe messes it up a bit. In that case here, our bevel segments might be a bit too wide. So it's then a matter of adjusting it a bit, but you can see that we can do pretty complex stuff in a very fast time. And then when we're happy, we can say apply, and that leaves us then with this geometry here. So what we can also do is use that primitive mode here and make our own geometry. If we toggle over to the polyline, we can then press once again Ctrl and left, and then we're able to make our own lines here. Might not be very pretty what I'm doing here, but just to demonstrate it. And then whenever we're happy, we say Ctrl and left, and that leaves us here with that shape, which we can then once again extrude out. And by the way, if we go, for example, here in the top view and press G, we're able to move it around. So now let's say we are happy with that. We can then again Ctrl and left. And then I'm gonna hit the escape button to confirm. And for example, in that case, let's have it a union. So this time I'm actually not gonna do the unbevel, just to demonstrate to you that we can also just hit the apply while we have the bevel modifier on top, and it will then automatically merge it and add the bevel to it. So let's apply, and here we go. So let's go back to the primitive mode once more. Let's say we're looking at a face here from the orthographic view, and let's take the rectangle here, for example. Now let's draw that anywhere. And if we want to center that, we can make use of this cursor. If we press Ctrl and the green button, it will center it here on the Z-axis. And if we put it anywhere else and then hit that blue button with Ctrl, it will center it on the Y-axis. And if we press the white button, it will center it on both axes, so that it will be in the center of our face. So that's a quick way to have it aligned. And then we can just proceed and make our Boolean operation here. So in that case here, let's have a difference. And then we can still, of course, change the position. Right now it's in the center. But as you know, we're able here to also move our operator around. And then we can also go over to our edit mode and, for example, use a bevel on it and then apply it. So that makes for a quick way to work here with this primitive mode. And what we can also do is add a mirror modifier by clicking on mirror. So that will be a non-destructive modifier that we can add on top and that we can toggle on and off. And if we like it, we can then apply it. But I'm just going to delete it. Another way that we can use the mirror is by clicking on these buttons, and it will then not add a modifier but do the mirror operation instantly. But the good thing is that the other modifiers are still intact, so we can toggle them on and off. So I'm just gonna go ahead and clear that scene out here. So let's get out of this primitive mode and let's have another cube. And now let's take a look at this Xray modifier, and we have two of them here. So it's already pretty much giving it away. This one here allows us to work on a specific axis. Can only be one, or we can also change it here in that direction if we want to. And that allows us to do this kind of operation here. Whatever we duplicate here will automatically become an instance. So if we go over here to the edit mode, it's becoming a bit more obvious. And it also adds a modifier that we can toggle on and off if we want. And then if we are happy with it, we can either apply it, or in that case, I'm just going to get rid of it. Now, let's also take a look at the circle array. So what is important to consider for the circle array is that it's basing it here on our cursor. So this one right here, which by default is in the center of X, Y, and Z, will be the origin from where on we do this circle array operation. So then same principle as before applies. We have these instances here now. And if we like it, we can collapse this modifier, or if we want to move it around, we can press A. And that will select everything, and we are then able to move it while we still maintain our modifier and can make changes to it. So if you're coming from 3D Max, you might be familiar with Reset X form. In Blender, we also have a Reset X form. And for example, if we have this stack of arrayed objects, and I'm just gonna apply it here, the modifier, and now we push that out here to the side. That means we change the orientation of it, and by pressing Ctrl and A, we bring up this dialog where we can reset all these different values here. We can do it individually for location, rotation, scale, or just for everything here. And now if you take a look at what happens to the pivot, it jumps back here to X, Y, and Z 0. So this might also be a good thing to just quickly reposition our pivot back to 0. And then, for example, we could just use that again here and have more of these instances. So lots of use cases for that, and that is where you can find that. So if you ever have a need to flip your normals, you can do that here in our edit mode. And now let's say we are in face mode and we have everything here selected and we want to invert these normals. Then we press Shift and N, and then nothing seems to happen, but we have this dialog appearing here now, recalculate normals. And if we say inside, you can see now the normals are flipped. So sometimes there's a use case for it, not too often, but that's where you can find that. I'm going to select everything that we have here in the scene and just gonna clear it out. And let's have another cube here in the scene. And I also want to subdivide it. I'm not sure where this extra X, Y, and Z came from, this black one here, but we don't need it. And I'm gonna turn it off here under extras. So now let's take a look at a cool new feature that got introduced with Blender 2.9, and it's the Extrude Manifold. Let's select it here in that sub-menu of the extrusion command. And now if we are in the face mode, we are now able to select an individual face and extrude essentially here to the inside. That would have caused some issues with the regular way of extruding. And now we have some sort of a smart extrude here. So that's a pretty cool new feature. And just to demonstrate how it used to be before, we have our extrude command here on D. And it's always possible to extrude here to the outside, but to the inside, we would get this. So this is essentially the difference with this manifold extrude, that we don't have to stress about that anymore. We can also make an extrusion here to the inside. So let me just undo that. And just to make it extra obvious, now here we don't have these extra faces to deal with. So it's a pretty cool new feature. But for now, I'm gonna leave our old extrude shortcut that we have set up for D, because I'm not sure how much use I'm really gonna make of that, but I'll see in the future. So now I wanna take a look at curves in Blender, also known as shapes, or in 3D Max, we call it splines. I'm gonna get out of the extrude mode, and I want to select edges here. So let's switch over to edge mode. And to demonstrate that better, I'm gonna make a bevel here. So now, while still being in edge mode, I press Shift and Alt, and this will also select these edges here. So now we can take that and press Shift and D, and then snap it back into place. And now with this active selection, we can press P and separate that out. So now we can go over to object mode and select this, and we could also isolate it here to make it more obvious. And now what we have is basically edges with vertex points. I'm just gonna go back here to the edit mode to make that more obvious. We have our vertex points, and here we have our edges. So right now, this is not a curve yet. What we have to do is take this selection, and then we go over to Object, and we say Convert to Curve. So now it's officially in curve, and you can see now that this symbol here changed to being a curve. So over here in that tab, we can then go over to Geometry, and we can then add depth to it. So this is how we do that. So as you can see, this is far from ideal because we don't have an even flow here. Wherever we have like a 90-degree angle, it kind of messes it up like that. And in case you wonder what we can do about that, we do have a fix if we put it to 2D. So this is how I would actually expect it to also work in 3D. And you might wonder, well, let's just always put it to 2D. So we could do that, but the problem is that if we also want to have Z information, then we can have that. So I'm just gonna take these, and let's say we want to have something like that here. Now we don't have any even flow here, and if we put it to 2D, it will then flatten it back here. So this is a bit of a issue right now, and I hope that eventually one day they're gonna fix that. Because right now in the 3D mode we have these inconsistent flows here, and 2D is the only one that fixes that. Either way, I'm not actually using that often either, but that's just something to be aware of. And also we can change the resolution here. So we can bring it down like that, all the way to basically just being 4 sides, or we could really crank it up a lot. So this is up to us. And then fill caps does as the name suggests, it caps it here. So these are basically splines in Blender, also known as curves. So then whenever we're happy with it, we can go back here to Object and say Convert to Mesh. So now it's regular polygon geometry here. And another thing that we can use the JMesh plugin for is to make that same selection here, just to demonstrate it, that we did before. So here's our selection. I'm going to snap it back. And now what we can do is hit that mesh to curve button over here. And it automatically does this step for us that otherwise we have to go over here to Object for. And we're ready then to work with it. Same applies as before, of course. We have to go in the 2D view here, or our 2D mode, in order to get rid of these uneven edges. But another useful tool that we have here in our JMesh plugin. So let's also take a look at text in Blender. Let's press Shift A, and that pops up our default menu here. And here we have text. So once we have that in the scene, it will always appear like that here. And right now we can't change it. For that we have to press Tab and go over to Edit Mode. Now we are basically in an edit mode specifically for text. So now we can just type in here whatever we want. And then we have our 3D text here. And then it's also pretty similar to what it is with the shapes. We go over here, and that pops up this menu where then we can, for example, extrude it. And what we can also do is add a bit of depth, and that will basically give us a bit of a bevel here around it, for which we can then also change the resolution if we want. And this is how we can make text in Blender. So I really think that this is as good as it gets here for our fundamentals of Blender. Let's go ahead and have some fun. I'm gonna delete that text here to clear out our scene. And let's make a Vulcan cannon round. And then we let it drop to the floor. First of all, I'm gonna put our units here to centimeters. And then I'm gonna have the link to the reference image in the description. I want to go over here to our front view. And then we're gonna add a reference image. So now I'm gonna navigate here to my reference. Like I said, I'm gonna provide it in the link. And now we don't see it because we still have to check extras on here. So now we see what we actually added in here as reference image. And now I'm gonna go ahead and create a cylinder and then put it here according to the sizes that we see on the ref image. Radius of 1.5 centimeters. And then we have a depth here of 16.8. So now we see that this is way smaller than our reference image. That's why we grab the reference image and now we just scale it down here till it fits our cylinder. I'm gonna put the cylinder to the Xray mode, and now we see better how we can scale it to really fit it. So just a little bit more adjustment here. And now let's just make sure it's centered as good as it can be here. I'm actually gonna push it a little bit more here to the right side. So now we have a nice center position here. And we can also make use of this measure tool to see if we actually got it right. And yes, we did. This is 3 centimeters. So let's make use of a new tool here that we haven't looked at before. It's the loop cut. By default, it will always align to the center, and I'm gonna make one connection there in the center. But if we keep our mouse button pressed, we can decide where we want these loops to be. So I add 2 more loops there at the top, and then also one here at the bottom. So now with these loops, we can go in Vertex mode, and I'm just gonna align it a bit here to our reference image. Just use the scale tool and make sure it's a uniform scale. The same here. And then let's also take that here and do the same thing. So let's just make sure we fit it here to our reference. Maybe this one here a little further down. And then I'm gonna actually go over here into that perspective and drag our reference image a little bit back out there so that we have this more isolated. So now let's take another look here at this, and I'm comparing it with our reference image. And basically what I want to do is go in the edge mode, and then I'm gonna bevel it here to make it nice and round. So over here, I'm also gonna select the edge loop, and I'm gonna make use of the bevel tool once more and have then these 2 sub loops in there, which now I'm selecting as a ring and scale it down. And this here up a bit. So let's take another look here on the upper part, and I want to go in Vertex mode and select these parts here and just make a bit of a uniform scale, and now vertical scale to make that a bit more thin. Here at the upper part, I'm also gonna make a loop selection, and then I want to bevel that here as well. And I'm gonna select this center part and press M and collapse it to the center. So right now we're only concerned about making this look good here, that 20mm Vulcan round. Later we're gonna duplicate it and drop it to the floor, which is going to be a lot of fun. So right now I notice that I don't like how I have this bullet selected, but it doesn't rotate around it, as you can see here. So we can change that in the preferences. If we go over to navigation and then we hit that orbit around selection button. And now we always have our selected object in the center, and I prefer that very much. So I'm gonna go ahead here with this tool once more and add some extra loops here according to our reference image where we have this extra ring. Now I'm gonna go over here to our face mode, and I make a selection for the projectile, and I press the P button and I separate it out by selection. So I'm gonna hide that selection so that we can focus on this here. I'm gonna make a loop selection, press F to fill it, then switch over to our face mode, and then let's make an inset on it just a little bit. Now we can use the extrude command that we have on D and bring that all the way down. So now on the upper right at the scene collection, I'm gonna hide this, activate this, and now we can also click on this little icon there on the left side so that we can actually work on it. So we don't always have to go out of the edit mode. Gonna do the same thing here. I'm gonna make an inset after we filled it. And now I'm just gonna bring this all the way down here. And as you can see, we have a bit of a bevel there. So what I'm doing is just another inset, and then followed by yet another inset. And that way we can also just have a bit of a bevel. So we don't always have to use the bevel command. We can also basically use the inset. It doesn't always have to be one action. I'm gonna have a subloop here and I'm gonna use the bevel on it. And now I'm selecting these two edge loops and I want to give it another bevel. And then I'm gonna make a ring selection here on the inner parts and make a uniform scale on it so that it looks like our reference. Gonna do the same here on that edge loop. And I'm gonna add another bevel loop here in the center, just using the mouse wheel and then selecting it and scaling it in. And here at the top, we also have this detail on the reference. I'm gonna use the loop cut tool once again to bring that edge exactly where we wanna have it. Followed by another bevel. And then let's select that edge loop and once again, let's scale it down. So here we have it. Now we can also unhide the rest of it. And one thing we still have to do is here at the bottom. Let's go over here, select this, and then bring it in with the inset. And I'm gonna follow up with another inset and press Control to give some depth to it. Let's do another inset and then once again Control to bring it down. And yet another inset which I'm gonna collapse. And then with the vertex selection, I'm just gonna bring that down a bit. So now it looks like we should probably bring that up again so that this actually could stand. Right now, this doesn't seem to be accurate. So now we have taken care of that. And essentially, that is the model that we want to have. I'm gonna apply a material to it. Let's go over here to that material preview mode. And we can use the color picker on our reference image. And then I'm gonna bring up the metallic. And what we can also do is put the shade smooth. And then what I also want to do is bring the roughness down so that this becomes more glossy. And now let's do the same thing here for the upper part where we have 3 different material types if you look at the reference image. I'm going to select the face at the bottom and press Ctrl and plus to grow the selection. And then I'm going to make a new material here for it. And just make it dark and let's assign it. So now I'm gonna make an edge selection here for a ring and also press Ctrl and plus to grow it. Make a new material and then let's use that color picker again to pick up on the actual color that we see on the reference and also assign it. And now for the upper part, obviously we have a blue. So what I want to do here is take it in the face selection mode. And now we just have to grow it once more so that we also have these faces there where it goes to the inside. Let's have a new material. And then let's once again pick up some of these blue colors that we have there. We can always modify that later. But then we assign that and now we have quickly done our color setup here according to our references. I'm gonna select these 2 objects, press Ctrl and J to join them. And now what we can do is bring up the JMesh tool and add a bevel to it. I'm not gonna use the bevel weights. Let's just use this here. And now let's see what that did, the JMesh tool. Let's further lower our amount here on the bevel. 0.05 should do the trick. And that way we have basically a perfect highpoly, but this part there doesn't pick it up. So let's carefully bring down the angle. And now you see, okay, 15-degree angle did the trick and everything else still looks good. So we don't necessarily always have to use the bevel weights. We can also just use the angle method. Let's go back to our materials. For that ring part, I want to bring up the metallicness and also lower the roughness to make it nice and glossy. And on the blue, I'm not gonna have metallic. It looks like it's just painted on, but let's make it a bit more glossy. So I think that pretty much does it. I'm not gonna add text to it. I know we have that on the reference, but instead, let's just take a look that this here looks good. And yeah, I was just pressing L to select the element and bring it up. And now we can press Ctrl Z to undo that because everything looks good. I'm just gonna delete the reference image because essentially that bullet is done, but I just wanna make that ring a little bit bigger. So I'm gonna go over here to Vertex mode while we are in the Xray mode to make that a bit bigger there, this ring. So now what I want to do is use the array tool here. We can do that also with the JMesh plugins. And now let's have 10 instances here. Let's close that and let's navigate to our modifier tab where now we have these 3 modifiers added here. And let's add another array modifier. I'm going to put X to 0 and then Y to 1, or actually a little bit more than that, so that we have some space in between there. And now let's increase the count to 7. Something like that. I mean, you can have as many as you want, but it's going to be also heavy on the performance. So let's drag that up here so that we can let it fall. And I'm not sure what these objects are here. They say they are empty, so I'm just going to delete them. As the next thing, let's collapse these array modifiers. So once we collapse them, everything here becomes essentially one element. I'm going to press P and say separate by loose parts. So now we can individually select each one of these elements. What I want to do now is press A so that we select everything. And now we need to give each one of them its own pivot point, because right now everything links only to one pivot point. So let's go to Object, Set Origin to Geometry. So now you can see every one actually has the pivot point in the center. And now we gotta add some physics magic to it. So we go over to the physics properties, we add a rigid body. I'm gonna put the mass to 1000 so that it drops really heavy, because that's not always accurate. I'm gonna leave it as active where it says type, and the collision type I put it to convex hull. That works pretty well. Now with this selection, I'm pressing A to select all the others once again. And then we want to go over to where it says rigid body and we say copy from active. So what that does, once we hit it, it applies our physics properties to each one of these objects. So now they all have it. Next, I'm gonna have a circle here added to our scene. I'm gonna increase the count for it to 128 so that it's nice and round. I'm gonna go over to the edit mode, make a loop selection and drag it down here with Extrude. Also gonna select the upper edge loop and I'm gonna bevel it so that we have this also nice and shaded and smoothed. Gonna scale it up a bit and then select all the upper ones here and also center it a bit more, so that once we let it drop, it's actually falling into the center of this object here. Speaking of which, let's go to rigid body and make this one here a passive type. The ones that we let fall are active. I'm gonna make a selection here on this and make a copy with Shift and D and then join it together with Ctrl and J and put it to passive. So with this selection active, we can then go over to our layout mode. And you can see now that we have to put our shading back on. So let's do that. And now we can snap into the orthographic view. And this extra one here, we're just gonna position it already on the floor so that this is a collision type for the other ones that we let drop. So in our time frame, let's say 30 frames, because we don't need to really load 250. Let's play that animation. And then once it's done loading, you can see here how that bullet is a passive type now. Once it's done loading, we can then pause the animation. And let's put it here maybe to frame 29. where we have this nice still image basically. So next, let's press A to select everything, and then we have to go to Object and apply Visual Transform, because if you want to reload your scene after you saved it, that way it will stay in place. So now let's add a point light to our scene. We don't see anything yet, but we have to go here into the proper render mode there on the upper right. Now you see that light actually affecting our scene. I want to go in the light properties, expand the menu and add contact shadows, which further makes it look nice here. I'm gonna also add another light, which is a sunlight this time. It doesn't really matter if we drag it up or not, I think. But this one too, I want to enable the contact shadows. Layout mode served its purpose. Now let's go to the shading mode here. Let's also enable our material view that shows us the lights. And now it's time to make this look good. Let's switch this to world. Let's press Shift and A to get the add menu, and we're gonna add an environment texture. Let's connect this here to the color slot, and then we open the default Blender HDRI images that already ship with Blender. Found here. I'm gonna add the courtyard scene, and now things start to look interesting. As you can see, we got a proper scene reflection from our texture map. Now let's just find an interesting angle on here. And then what we can do is on the right side, we go into our scene properties, this one here, and let's enable ambient occlusion. I'm gonna bring that down a bit, doesn't need to be so strong, but just enough to have some extra depth added to it. And then what we can also add is some bloom. The default is too strong. We actually have to crank it up to make it less. So it's a matter of just looking at it and trying out the different settings pretty much till it looks good. Screen space reflections is a very important one. Now we have a proper reflection from within our 3D models. I want to turn off the half-res trace so we have it looking better. And then we won't be needing everything here, but here under shadows, we can, for example, if we turn off soft shadows, it becomes a bit harder, but that's really up to us what we like. And then what else do we got here? Under color management, we can have some different contrast modes. So if we put that here to high contrast, you will see that everything gets a bit stronger here on our image. So once again, that's a matter of trying it out. And then this actual plate that we have here, let's add a material to it. And now with a screen space reflection, if we turn that here dark, and then we add it to being metallic, we got some nice mirror reflection here on the floor. So first, let's make it metallic. And that already adds a whole lot of interesting depth here to it. And then with the roughness, we got a proper reflection going here, which is pretty nice. So I'm gonna go back to the scene properties for our lights. And then what we can also do is go back to screen space reflection. And if we adjust the edge fading, we can sort of tune how much visibility we want to have on it. So maybe I put that to, let's have it at 0.1, somewhere around there. So now there's just one more thing to do, which is zooming out here, just to make it clear. This is the currently selected object, and I just want to shade smooth it so that we have some nice edges there. And then we can also scale it down so that it fits this better here and it's not so in your face and too big. So now I'm just gonna bring that up because we just scaled it. And essentially now we have this scene here. We just need to add a camera to it. Shift and A. And then you can see the camera is now facing a completely different direction. So in order to look through the camera, we position it here something like that and press Ctrl Alt Numpad 0. Now let's go to the camera settings because we're actually looking through it now. We can still use the mouse wheel to zoom in and out. And if we go here to the camera settings, we can also change a bit the parameters here, and we can even put it to different focal length. I mean, not even, but of course. But we can also put it to orthographic view if we want. So now we would just have to scale back in here. And for example, this here might make a nice picture. So I'm just going to zoom out a bit with the mouse wheel once again. We're still in the camera. And then what we can do is also add depth of field to add some extra interest here to it. Bring that focus distance down. And maybe so that it highlights the one that's standing up here. That's really the one that we want. And there might be better angles that you can experiment around with. Might not be the best render ever here, but just as a quick demonstration how to do that. Then we can put our render passes up to have a better quality on the sampling, and we hit that render button and essentially just wait for it to be done. And that is how to make renders in Blender. Obviously there is much more to it, but to give you a quick introduction of that here as well. So here's our image. And one thing that I forgot to mention is if we want to close that here and let's say we want to change our resolution, we do that here under the output properties. You can see if we change this here, it reflects our dimensions there. So I'm just going to leave it at 1920 and 1080. We can also change the image output, PNG or JPEG, and then when we're happy, we go on render once again. And that concludes the introduction to Blender tutorial. I hope you liked it. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel if you did, and come hang out with us in the Chamfer Zone Discord, where amateurs come together with industry professionals. Is a very great community we got there. And stay tuned for more tutorials to come very soon.